The umbrella lived in the same spot by the front door for as long as Teresa Sutcliffe could remember. Not in a closet with the others, not folded away out of sight, but standing upright in an old ceramic stand just inside the entryway, so that it was the first thing anyone saw upon stepping into her father's house, and the last thing he touched every single morning before he walked outside. It was an old-fashioned thing, black, with a wooden handle worn smooth and pale where countless hands had gripped it. Its ribs mended in at least 2 places with a careful visible line of stitching that Teresa had always assumed was simply her father's frugality. Emory Sutcliffe had never been a man who replaced something he believed could still be repaired. She was 49 years old on the afternoon she finally asked him about it directly, sitting with him in the small kitchen of the house she'd grown up in, 3 weeks after a doctor's appointment that had confirmed what the family had already begun quietly suspecting, the beginning of a cognitive decline that would, in all likelihood, continue to progress. "Dad," she said, watching him turn his teacup slowly on its saucer, the particular unhurried gesture that had become, over the preceding several months, a kind of pause he used when he needed a moment to find his footing in a conversation. "I want to ask you something. About the umbrella. You've had the same one my whole life. Longer than that, probably. I've never once seen you carry a different one. Not even after the handle cracked that winter and you had it fixed instead of just buying a new one. Why does it matter so much to you?" Emory was quiet for a long moment, looking toward the front hall, where the umbrella stood exactly where it always stood, a fixture so consistent that Teresa understood, watching her father's face. She had never once actually seen him look at it directly before, only past it, the way you look past something so familiar it has become nearly invisible. "It isn't mine," he said finally, his voice carrying a specific, careful weight. "Not originally. I borrowed it, a very long time ago, from someone I never managed to properly thank. I've been meaning to return it for 58 years. Teresa set down her own cup. 58 years. She repeated slowly. "Dad, who did you borrow it from?" Emory looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression, a specific, quiet vulnerability Teresa had rarely seen from her steady, undemonstrative father across her entire life, told her that whatever answer was coming would reshape considerably more than the modest, undramatic history of an old umbrella. "I've never told anyone the whole story," he said. "Not your mother, not you, not your brother. I think, before I lose the ability to tell it properly, I'd like to finally say it out loud." Teresa Sutcliffe was 49 years old, a family physician at a busy community clinic, married to a steady, thoughtful man named Adrian, mother to a college-age son who had grown up, as Teresa herself had, quietly amused by his grandfather's specific, undramatic eccentricities. The same umbrella carried for as long as anyone could remember. The yearly late autumn walk Emory always took alone through a part of the city none of the family had any particular connection to, a walk he had maintained without fail for as long as Teresa could recall, departing early in the morning and returning several hours later, offering only a brief, contented good walk if anyone asked how it had gone. Emory Sutcliffe had spent 41 years as an accountant for a mid-sized manufacturing firm, a career Teresa had always understood as simply the practical, steady choice of a practical, steady man. He had married Teresa's mother, Doreen, at 26, had raised 2 children in the same modest house he still lived in now, widowed for the past 6 years since Doreen's death, managing his own household with the same careful, undramatic competence he had always brought to everything. He was, by every account Teresa had ever had reason to believe, a man who had lived an entirely ordinary life. Steady, undramatic, defined by reliability rather than any particular event or ambition. She had never once, across 49 years, suspected that a single afternoon from his 20th year might have shaped the entire remaining architecture of who he became. She had noticed, of course, the umbrella's particular consistency, and the yearly walk, the way children notice their parents' small, repeated habits without ever thinking to interrogate them, filed away, without particular scrutiny, as simply part of the unremarkable furniture of who her father was. Teresa's own present life carried a specific, quiet uncertainty she had been circling for the better part of a year without fully admitting its size to herself. Her clinic's regional health system had offered her, several months earlier, the opportunity to lead a new community outreach program aimed at expanding care access to several underserved neighborhoods on the far side of the city. Meaningful work, considerably more demanding than her current position, requiring her to step away from the comfortable, well-worn rhythm of a practice she had built over nearly 2 decades and take on something uncertain, something that might fail, something that would require her to be publicly, visibly responsible for an outcome she couldn't fully control. She had told the health system she needed more time to consider it. 6 months later, she still had not given them an answer, telling herself, each time the decision surfaced, that she needed to think it through more carefully, that the timing wasn't quite right, that there would be a clearer, more obvious moment to finally decide. She had not yet recognized, sitting across from her father in his small kitchen with an old umbrella standing in the front hall, exactly how directly her own comfortable, endlessly deferred decision was about to be confronted by the shape of a single, decisive moment her father had lived through 58 years earlier, a moment he had spent his entire subsequent life quietly trying to properly honor. "I was 20 years old," Emory began, his hands wrapped around his teacup, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the kitchen window. "I'd just been asked to leave the university. At the end of my second year, I'd failed nearly everything that final semester. Not because the material was too difficult, but because I'd simply stopped attending most of my classes, stopped turning in my assignments, stopped doing almost anything except sitting alone in my dormitory room, convinced I'd already ruined my entire future before it had even properly begun." He paused, and Teresa waited, understanding that whatever came next needed to arrive at its own pace. "My parents had scraped together everything they had to send me there," he continued. "My father worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood so that I could be the first person in our family to attend university, and I'd wasted the whole opportunity through nothing but my own paralysis and shame, and I couldn't bear the thought of going home and telling them. I remember standing at the bus station that afternoon with a single suitcase, having decided, not entirely rationally, I understand now, looking back with the distance of 58 years, that I would simply get on whatever bus left soonest, go wherever it happened to be going, and never tell my family what had actually happened. I think some part of me believed disappearing entirely was kinder than showing up and admitting my failure to their faces." Teresa felt her breath catch, understanding, with a specific ache, the shape of what her father was describing, not simply an ordinary youthful setback, but a genuine crossroads, the kind that could have redirected an entire life down a considerably darker path than the one Emory had actually lived. "A storm came through while I was standing outside the station, working up the resolve to actually buy a ticket," Emory continued. "A hard, sudden rain, the kind that seems to arrive out of nowhere in late autumn. I ducked under the awning of a shop across the street, a shoe repair shop I remember, though it's long gone now, replaced by something else decades ago. There was already someone sheltering there, a woman, perhaps in her early 40s, holding a black umbrella she hadn't yet opened, apparently caught by the same sudden downpour." He smiled faintly, the first small softening Teresa had seen in his expression since the conversation began. "She said something ordinary, I think. Some comment about the weather, the kind of small talk strangers make to fill an awkward silence. I must have looked considerably worse than I realized, because after a few minutes, she asked, quite directly, whether I was all right. I don't remember exactly what I told her. I don't think I told her the whole truth, not the specific plan I'd been forming. But I think I told her enough, that I'd disappointed my family badly, that I didn't know how to face them, that I was thinking of simply not going home at all. She listened. She didn't try to fix anything, or lecture me, or tell me everything would be fine. She just listened, for perhaps 10 minutes, while the rain continued, asking a few gentle questions, letting me talk." "What did she say?" Teresa asked quietly. "She told me that failure at 20 almost never looks the way you think it will once you're 70, Emory said. She told me she'd failed at things too, in her own life, considerably more publicly and considerably more painfully than a single bad semester at university, and that she was still here, still building something worth having, decades later. She said the specific shame I was feeling in that exact moment would fade, whether or not I let it push me into a decision I couldn't take back. And then, when the rain started to let up slightly, she pressed her umbrella into my hands and told me to take it. I tried to refuse, told her I only had a short way to go, that she needed it more than I did. She said, "You have further to go than me tonight. Take it." And then she stepped out into the last of the rain and walked off, and I never saw her again. Emory set down his teacup, his hands steadier now than they had been at the start of the conversation, as though the act of finally speaking the story aloud had settled something in him that 58 years of private silence had never quite managed to settle on its own. "I went home that night," he said. "Not to the bus station, not to wherever that ticket might have taken me. I walked to my parents' house instead, and I told them everything, that I'd failed out, that I'd wasted their sacrifice, all of it. My father was disappointed, of course, but he wasn't the catastrophe I'd built up in my mind. We talked. I found work the following month, enrolled in night classes 2 years later, eventually finished my degree part-time while working full-time during the day. None of it happened the way I'd originally planned. But I think, without that 10 minutes under an awning, I might have gotten on that bus instead, and I have no idea what the rest of my life would have looked like if I had." "You kept the umbrella," Teresa said. "I meant to return it," Emory said. "The very next day, in fact. I went back to the shoe repair shop, thinking she might be a regular customer there, someone the owner would recognize. He didn't know who I was describing. I walked the surrounding blocks for hours, hoping I might simply encounter her again by chance, the way I had the first time. I never did. I didn't have a name. She never gave me one, and in my own distress that evening, I never thought to ask. I only had a rough sense of the direction she'd walked when she left, and a black umbrella that had, in the space of 10 minutes, quite possibly saved the entire remaining shape of my life." "So you kept it," Teresa said again, softer this time. "I told myself for the first several years that I would eventually find her," Emory said. "That the debt was still active, still waiting to be properly settled. I started walking that same route once a year, on the anniversary of that storm, in case some version of chance might bring us into the same place again, the way it had the first time. It never did, but I couldn't bring myself to stop carrying the umbrella or stop taking the walk, because doing either felt like giving up on ever properly thanking her, like accepting that the debt would simply go unpaid forever, which felt, somehow, like a smaller kind of failure layered on top of the first one." Teresa sat with this for a long moment, looking at her father, a man she had known her entire life, who she had always understood as simply steady, undramatic, defined by reliability rather than any specific defining event, and understood, with a growing and humbling clarity, that his entire adult temperament had likely been built, at least in part, on the foundation of a single conversation under a shop awning that had taught him, at 20, exactly how much difference one stranger's unhurried kindness could make in the life of someone standing at the edge of an irreversible decision. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked gently. Emory looked toward the front hall again, toward the old umbrella standing in its ceramic stand. "Because the doctor tells me I'm going to start losing things," he said, his voice carrying a specific, careful honesty Teresa had rarely heard from him. "Memories mostly at first. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to make that yearly walk and actually remember why I'm making it. I don't know how much longer I'll look at this umbrella and understand what it actually represents, rather than just some old object I've apparently decided, for no clear reason, never to replace. I think I'd like to try, one more time, properly, to find her, or to at least learn what became of her, while I still have the memory intact enough to know why it matters." Teresa began her research the following week, working from the small handful of details her father could still offer: the approximate location of the shop, long since replaced, the general direction the woman had walked, her rough age at the time, suggesting she would now be somewhere in her 90s, if she were still alive at all, and a single small detail Emory recalled only after considerable thought, that the woman had mentioned, in passing, working nearby, at what he believed had been a small textile shop or a dressmaker's, somewhere within a few blocks of where they'd sheltered. Teresa visited the local historical society, working with an archivist to pull city directories from the year in question, cross-referencing every dressmaker and textile business listed within the specific radius her father's memory suggested. She found 4 possible matches and began, over the following weeks, tracing whatever public records remained for each: old business licenses, property records, the scattered, incomplete paper trail of small enterprises that had mostly closed decades earlier, their owners long since moved on or passed away. She found herself, during this period, thinking constantly about her father's story, the specific, narrow margin between the life he had actually lived and the considerably darker, unknown path a stranger's 10 minutes of kindness had apparently redirected him away from. She found herself thinking, too, with growing and uncomfortable clarity, about her own 6 months of deferred decision regarding the outreach program, the specific, comfortable paralysis she had been quietly practicing while telling herself she simply needed more time. She mentioned this parallel to Adrian one evening, sitting together at their own kitchen table with a stack of old city directories spread in front of her. "I keep thinking about how close my father came to just disappearing," she said, "getting on a bus, going wherever it happened to be headed, never telling his family what had actually happened. And I keep thinking about how small the thing was that stopped him. Just a stranger, talking to him for 10 minutes under an awning, handing him an umbrella. I don't think either of them understood, in that exact moment, how much weight that small kindness was actually carrying." "Do you see the parallel to your own situation?" Adrian asked gently. "The outreach program?" Teresa considered this. "I think I've been standing at my own version of that bus station for 6 months, she admitted. "Not anything as dramatic as what my father faced, but a real crossroads regardless, a chance to do something considerably more uncertain and considerably more meaningful than what I'm currently doing. And I keep finding reasons to simply not decide yet, the way he almost decided to just disappear rather than face something difficult and uncertain." "What's stopping you?" Adrian asked. "I think I'm afraid of failing at it publicly," Teresa said slowly. "The way my father was afraid of failing at university, in front of his parents. I think I've been telling myself that not deciding is safer than risking a visible failure. I don't think that's actually true. I think it's just a quieter, more comfortable way of failing by default, without ever having to admit that's what I'm doing." She returned to her research with a renewed specific urgency in the weeks that followed, understanding, with growing clarity, that finding this woman, or at least learning what had become of her, had become entangled, in Teresa's own mind, with her own overdue decision about the outreach program, 2 separate crossroads that had somehow, through her father's story, become quietly linked in her thinking. Emory's memory, meanwhile, showed the ordinary gradual signs the doctor had warned the family to expect. Small lapses, a repeated question asked twice within the same conversation, an afternoon the previous month when he had briefly, disorientingly forgotten which of his grandchildren was visiting before the confusion lifted as suddenly as it had arrived. Teresa understood, watching these small changes accumulate, that whatever time remained for her father to participate meaningfully in this search was considerably more limited than either of them wanted to admit directly. The breakthrough came nearly 2 months into Teresa's research, through a retired local historian named Coraline Frist, who had spent decades documenting the specific commercial history of that particular neighborhood and maintained, in her own private archive, records considerably more detailed than anything the Historical Society's public files could offer. "I believe I know exactly who you're describing," Coraline said, after Teresa had explained the story over the phone, describing the small dressmaker's shop her father recalled, the woman's approximate age, the general time frame. There was a woman named Agnes Whitfield who ran a small tailoring and dressmaking business, 2 blocks from where you've described, from the early 1950s until she retired in the early 1980s. She had a considerable reputation in the neighborhood, not just for her work, but for a specific kindness people still occasionally mention, even decades later when the old shops from that era come up in conversation. I remember, from my own research years ago, more than one account of Agnes helping someone through a difficult moment, seemingly as a matter of ordinary habit rather than any particular occasion. "Is she still alive?" Teresa asked, her voice unsteady. Coraline was quiet for a moment. "I'm afraid not," she said gently. "Agnes passed away 11 years ago at the age of 93, but her granddaughter still lives in the area, I believe. She's spoken at a few local historical events over the years, sharing family stories about her grandmother's shop. I could try to put you in touch, if you'd like." Teresa sat with this news for a long moment after the call ended, feeling a complicated mixture of grief and relief. Grief that her father's decades-long hope of somehow thanking Agnes directly had, in the most literal sense, arrived too late, and relief that there was still, apparently, a path toward understanding the fuller shape of who this woman had been, and toward finally, even now, delivering some version of the gratitude her father had carried for 58 years. She reached Agnes's granddaughter, a woman named Priscilla Hartwell, by phone the following week, and found herself, partway through explaining the story, moved nearly to tears by Priscilla's immediate warm recognition of the details. "My grandmother used to tell a story like that," Priscilla said, her own voice carrying a specific startled emotion, "about a young man she met once, under an awning, during a storm. She never knew his name, never learned what became of him, but she talked about that afternoon more than almost any other single memory from her whole life. Said she often wondered, right up until she died, whether that small conversation had actually mattered, or whether she'd simply imagined its significance because she wanted to believe her ordinary kindnesses added up to something larger. It mattered," Teresa said, her voice unsteady. "It mattered more than either of them ever knew, on either side. My father is 80 years old right now, has an entire family, an entire life he built, and he spent 58 years believing he owed her a debt he never got the chance to repay. He still has the umbrella she gave him. He's never once, in 58 years, used a different one." Priscilla was quiet for a long moment. "I think you need to bring him to meet me," she said finally. "I have things of my grandmother's I think he should see, and I think she would have wanted to know, more than almost anything else, that the boy from the storm actually made it home safely that night." Teresa brought her father to meet Priscilla 3 weeks later, driving him herself, understanding, from the specific quality of his questions along the way, asking twice, within the span of an hour, exactly where they were headed and why, that his memory had continued its gradual decline in the weeks since Coraline's initial call. But when Priscilla opened her front door, and Emory saw the framed photograph she had waiting on her entryway table, Agnes Whitfield, perhaps in her 60s in the photograph, standing outside the same small dressmaker's shop Emory had once sheltered beside. Something in his expression shifted, sharpened, the specific recognition of a memory that had apparently remained, even amid the ordinary fog of the preceding months, entirely intact. "That's her," he said quietly, his voice unsteady. "I'd know her anywhere. Even 58 years later, I'd know her anywhere." They sat together in Priscilla's living room for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, Priscilla sharing what she remembered of her grandmother's own account of that storm, details Emory himself had never known, having only ever experienced his own side of the 10-minute conversation. Agnes had told her family, across the decades, that she had recognized something specific and urgent in the young man's distress that afternoon, something that had gone beyond ordinary disappointment, though she had never been entirely certain, until the day she died, whether her instinct to intervene had actually made any real difference, or whether she had simply imagined its significance out of her own private hope that small kindnesses mattered as much as she wanted to believe they did. "She would have been so relieved to know," Priscilla said, watching Emory's eyes fill as he listened. "I think that uncertainty followed her, in its own quiet way, for the rest of her life, never knowing for certain whether that afternoon had actually changed anything, or whether it was simply one of hundreds of ordinary kindnesses she'd extended over a long career, indistinguishable from all the others in its actual impact." "It changed everything," Emory said, his voice breaking. "I went home that night instead of getting on a bus to nowhere. I finished my education. I married. I raised 2 children. I have grandchildren now. None of it would have happened, not in the shape it actually took, without those 10 minutes under that awning." Priscilla reached into a small box she had prepared before their visit and produced a second umbrella. nearly identical to the one Emory had carried for 58 years, black, with a matching wooden handle, clearly purchased as part of an original pair. She kept the matching one, Priscilla said. For her entire life, I always assumed it was simply sentimental, an ordinary object she'd grown attached to, the way people sometimes do. I never once understood, until your call, that it might have been connected to a specific memory she carried alongside it the entire time, wondering about a stranger she'd never see again. Emory took the second umbrella in his hands, turning it over slowly, and Teresa watched her father's face move through decades of accumulated hope and uncertainty, finally, gently, resolving into something that looked, for the first time in the entire preceding 2 months, like genuine and complete peace. Teresa drove her father home that evening in a comfortable, settled quiet, both of them carrying in their own way the specific weight of a 58-year debt that had finally, if imperfectly, found its way to a resolution neither of them had fully expected to receive. I wish I could have thanked her myself, Emory said, near the end of the drive, looking out at the passing street lights. Properly, in person, the way I always intended to. I think I'll have to be all right with this instead, knowing what became of her, knowing she never forgot that afternoon either, even without ever learning what it actually meant. I think that might be the more honest ending anyway, Teresa said gently. Not the clean, perfect reunion you might have imagined for 58 years. Just the truth, that it mattered to both of you separately for your entire lives, without either of you ever getting the confirmation you were hoping for until now. Emory was quiet for a moment. You should take the outreach position, he said unexpectedly, turning to look at her directly. I know that's not what we've been discussing today, but I've been thinking about it since Adrian mentioned it to me last month. I think you've been standing at your own version of that bus station for longer than you've wanted to admit. I think I have been, she admitted. I think I've been telling myself I needed more time to decide, the same way you must have told yourself for a little while, that there'd be a better moment to go home and face your parents. I don't think there ever really is a better moment. I think you just eventually have to choose, and trust that whatever happens afterward is more survivable than the not choosing. I decided that afternoon under the awning, Emory said quietly, not because Agnes told me exactly what to do. She never gave me instructions. She just reminded me in 10 ordinary minutes that failure at 20 rarely looks the way you think it will from the inside of it. I think that's all any of us can really offer each other, most of the time. Not the answer, just enough steadiness to help someone find their own way to it. Teresa accepted the outreach program position the following week, calling the health system director on a Tuesday morning with a clarity and certainty that surprised even herself, understanding, as she made the call, that she had finally allowed her father's decades-old story to do for her exactly what Agnes's 10 minutes under an awning had once done for him. Not resolve her fear entirely, but provide enough steadiness to finally choose, rather than continuing indefinitely to defer the choice itself. She visited her father regularly over the following months, watching his memory continue its gradual, ordinary decline, though she noticed, with a specific tenderness, that certain things remained remarkably resistant to the fog that claimed so much else. He never once, in all the months that followed, forgot Agnes's name, or the specific shape of that storm, or the particular weight of what her small kindness had actually meant across the entire remaining architecture of his life. He gave Teresa the original umbrella on one of these visits, the one he had carried for 58 years, its ribs mended twice, its handle worn smooth by decades of daily use. I'd like you to have this now, he said. I have the matching one Priscilla gave me. I think it's right that they should belong to different people, the way Agnes and I were always meant to be two separate people whose lives simply happened to touch, briefly, under one shop awning, rather than staying permanently tangled together the way I sometimes wish they might. Teresa kept the umbrella by her own front door after that, in a spot that quickly became, without her fully planning it, the same fixed and unremarkable place it had always occupied in her father's house. The first thing she saw leaving each morning, a small physical reminder of exactly how much difference a single stranger's unhurried patience could make in the life of someone standing, however briefly, at the edge of an irreversible decision. She began, in the months that followed, making a specific, deliberate effort in her own new role at the outreach program to offer exactly the kind of unhurried, ordinary attention Agnes had once offered her father, pausing, more often than her previous, busier pace had ever allowed, to genuinely notice when a patient seemed to be carrying something considerably heavier than the immediate medical concern in front of her, understanding, with a clarity she hadn't fully possessed before her father's story, that she had no way of knowing which of these small, unremarkable pauses might someday turn out to have mattered as enormously as 10 minutes under an awning once had. Emory Sutcliffe died 2 years later, at 82, his memory having faded considerably in the final months, but never once, as far as the family could ever confirm, losing its grip on the single afternoon that had apparently shaped everything that followed it. Teresa found, going through his belongings afterward, a small notebook in which he had continued, even in his last clearer months, jotting brief notes about Agnes, fragments of the story, repeated to himself, as though determined to keep the memory intact for as long as his own mind allowed him to. She kept both umbrellas after that, her father's original and the matching one Priscilla had given him, displayed together by her own front door, side by side, exactly the way Agnes had once purchased them, decades before either woman could have imagined the specific, quiet significance either object would eventually come to hold. She thought, often, in the years that followed, about the particular humbling arithmetic of an act of kindness extended without any expectation of ever learning its outcome. Agnes offering 10 unhurried minutes and an umbrella to a frightened stranger, never once certain, across the following decades of her own long life, whether the gesture had actually mattered or had simply dissolved, unremembered, into the ordinary churn of a busy life lived among countless small, forgotten interactions. She understood now, standing some mornings by her own front door, with her hand resting briefly on the smooth, worn handle of her father's 58-year debt, that most kindness is offered exactly this way, without confirmation, without follow-up, without any guarantee that the person extending it will ever learn whether it changed anything at all. And she understood, too, that this uncertainty had never once been a reason for Agnes, or for anyone, to withhold the kindness itself. Some debts, she had come to believe, are never fully repayable in the exact form they were first extended. An umbrella cannot truly compensate for an entire redirected life, any more than a single afternoon of gratitude, delivered 58 years late to a woman already 11 years gone, could ever fully close the account her father had spent his whole adult life quietly trying to settle. But some debts, she had also come to believe, don't actually need to be closed in order to matter. They simply need to be carried forward, faithfully, for as long as a life allows, an object kept by a door, a yearly walk retraced without fail, a small act of unhurried attention offered to the next frightened stranger standing, however briefly, at the edge of their own irreversible decision.